Alex Richer is a research scientist at Meta Reality Labs in Pittsburgh, where he works on neural audio rendering and audiovisual modeling for photorealistic avatars. He received his PhD from the University of Bonn, Germany. His work has been recognized with outstanding paper award at ICLEAR 2021. Today, he'll be giving a talk on 3D audio rendering for social telepresence. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thanks, Chang'an. Before I start, I want to do a very small social experiment in this room. I want everyone to raise your hand if you have friends or family living in a city that is at least 2 hours from where you currently live. That is basically everyone, and that is not a surprise, right? Everyone in this room who has like friends or family in another country, please also raise your hand. Again, that's almost everyone. And that is not surprising, right? We are researchers, and we go to the places where we can do what we are passionate about, where we can do the research that we love. And that always comes at the cost that we have to move away. But this is a problem that is not exclusive to researchers. In today's world, almost everyone at some point in their life faces the point where you have to move away. Maybe not to another continent, maybe not to another country, but at least to another city. And every time you move, you leave meaningful relationships behind. And that's the same position that I was in a couple of years ago before I joined Reality Labs. I'm originally from Germany, Cologne. It's a beautiful city. My parents lived just 2 hours by car from there, and I grew up there in the close neighborhood, and I know a lot of people there. And when I moved over to the US, to Pittsburgh, to start my job, I thought I can easily maintain these relationships, which was a bit naive because it's really hard. It's a long flight, and it's really hard to keep in touch with everyone. And then the pandemic hit, and things got even worse, and I was basically cut off from a real physical interaction with my family, with my friends, for more than 2 years. And that is a difficult time, and it's the time where relationships easily deteriorate. And there are some tools, luckily, that we have these days that help us keeping relationships going. The easiest thing we can do is just use text messages. And that is great to exchange information, but it really falls short in many, many ways. If I really want to get a better communication, for example, with my mom, I just would call her. I get the same information that I get in text messages, and on top of that, I get some nonverbal information that is encoded in voice. For example, I can hear if she's feeling sad or happy, and I get like these subtle nonverbal cues over a phone call. But then again, some of you, look at the slides, which is great. Others of you look at me. And when you look at me, you will see that I have facial expression and I use my body. I have body language, which also is a very important part of communication and a very important part of how we gather signal about how people are feeling and how we approach communication. And the best system that we have currently available to do this remotely is video calling. And video calling falls short of real conversations in many ways. If I have a video call with you, you are like a small two-dimensional rectangle in my room, I'm a small two-dimensional rectangle in your room. You see me here standing on the stage, and I use my full body to give this presentation, and that is something you do not get in video calls. And then also, video calls are just a 2D world. I cannot move around and see you from another angle. And the same for audio. I only hear mono audio from whatever my device is. I can't move around and all of a sudden your voice comes from a different direction. And everyone who has ever been on a Zoom call with like 5 or more people and all of a sudden 3, 4 people start talking at the same time will know what I mean. It's completely delusive to think that you can still have a grasp on what's going on. On the other hand, if we have a real conversation, we could easily stand in a group of like 10 people. Everyone could be chatting, and I can still pay attention to one single person and have a conversation with this one single person. If you have been out there during lunch, you will have been in that situation, right? Hundreds of people around you, everyone is talking, but you were able to really have a conversation with someone else. And the reason for that is that our bodies over time evolved to be perfectly adapted to this 3D world that we live in, to the physical world that we live in. So if we really want to have a communication system that works well and that best serves what our bodies evolved to, we need to build a communication system that mimics our 3-dimensional world, both visually and acoustically, to the best degree that it can. Essentially meaning we want to build a photorealistic and phonorealistic environment where audio and visual sensory information are essentially indistinguishable from reality. If we can achieve that, we can really close the gap that we currently have in remote communication. And that is exactly our mission that we have in our lab in Pittsburgh. You see Yasser here having a chat with Danny in one of our offices. And you see, there's full bodies involved, body language. They are in the same shared space with the same lighting and everything. Now, Yasser is still in Pittsburgh, but Danny moved away. So if they now want to have this conversation, it has to be remote. And what we envision is that one day Yasser will just put on his virtual reality device, and Danny on her side would put on her virtual reality device, and what they see is exactly the scene in the middle. They are kind of teleported in a photorealistic room that is indistinguishable in terms of appearance from a real room, and they see themselves and they see the other person, the body avatar that looks photorealistic, basically exactly like you look in reality. And when they talk to each other, they sound exactly like they sound in reality. That would be the ideal communication system, and that is like the gold standard that we want to reach. And that is a high bar to get there. And there are many components that are all interconnected. We call it the trinity of telepresence. There is, of course, avatars, photorealistic avatars that look exactly like you. And then there are spaces, rooms like this room, where you can be in with your avatar. And there is, of course, a connection between the two. This connection is light transport. It's like, how is your avatar relit, depending on the light sources on the scene, and in the other direction, your avatar would cast a shadow on the scene, things like that. This is an audiovisual workshop, so I'm not talking about light transport here. But there are connections to audio as well, right? Spaces to audio, reverberation in a room, audio to avatars. That is, for example, we heard something about personalized HRTFs, about hearing, that is depending on how your head is shaped, how your ears are shaped, things like that. So there are interdependencies between all of those things. And before I dive deeper into the topic, I want to show you something that we released actually about a year ago. On the left, you see a pre-recorded avatar. This is not live-driven, of our director Yasser. But on the right, you see Elaine wearing a virtual reality headset, and she can basically live walk around. And on the video, you see what she will be seeing in VR. Just unfortunately in 2D, because that's all we can do with video. I will just let Yasser explain what's going on here.
Hi there. My name is Yasser, and I direct the Facebook Reality Research Lab in Pittsburgh. Well, that's not completely true. What you're seeing is actually a rendering of my pre-recorded codec avatar. Over the past couple of years, we've made quite a bit of progress with codec avatars. My avatar can now look left, look right, look up, look down, make facial expressions, ooh, and natural hand gestures like snapping your fingers, pointing, counting, cracking your knuckles, and also challenging body poses that involve self-contact.
That looks really good. And that's a really good start, but of course there are a lot of research miracles that we have to solve along the way to really roll the system out, to scale it, and to solve everything that we can't do yet. My team is primarily focusing on everything that is related to audio there, which means 3D audio rendering, something I'm going to talk about today, and also audio-visual learning for avatars and speech. I'm not going deep on this part of the connection between audio and avatars, but at least I want to tease the directions we are working on and what we are doing. There are, of course, two directions along this axis. One is from avatars to audio, meaning how can we leverage the visual information that we know from avatars to get better audio. A prominent example would be audiovisual speech enhancement, where you have a very noisy input because you're in an environment like a cafe or at home, you have family, your kids are loud, something like this.
The other one is like Overboard. That is a movie that I watched a lot.
And what we ultimately want to get is a clean system where you transmit only what you are saying, but not what is happening in the background.
Oh, the other one is like Overboard. That is a movie that I watched a lot.
The output here is actually not ground truth. It's actually what the system produces. So it's a really high quality, and it was really exciting to combine these two modalities. The other directions where audio and avatars are connected is, of course, how can we animate avatars if we only have audio sensors? You have seen the Aria glasses in an earlier talk this morning, and you know, they are basically the size of my glasses here, not much bigger. So it's impossible to mount cameras on these devices that really see how your face is moving, that can really observe your mouth. So the only option for these kind of devices that we have to animate avatars is using audio. And we were actually looking in this direction as well. In this work, we present a generic method for generating full facial 3D animation from speech. With this method, we can animate identities just given their template mesh. That's all exciting, but I can't cover everything in a few minutes, so what I want to dive deeper into is 3D neural rendering for audio. So basically the connection between spaces and audio, right? You are here, how do I perceive your sound? There is also a kind of connection to the avatars because it's related to your ear shape and to your HRTFs. So if we think back to the video that I just showed you, you could see a space in the background, and the space is completely rendered with nerve-style methods. So it's basically neural rendering for graphics. And the same for the avatar. That's a neural renderer that generates this avatar here. And for audio, well, spatial audio, the state of the art there is still kind of based on traditional methods. And what I am propagating is here, we should use data-driven methods, and we should do the shift to machine learning-based methods for audio rendering. In order to motivate this, let's have a very short excursion in how traditional signal processing deals with spatial audio. The idea is fairly simple. You have a listener in the middle with a left ear and a right ear, and you have a sound source. And from that sound source, you play a signal, and then you measure the transfer function. So you get one function that for this specific pair of transmitter-receiver position can generate the left ear and right ear signal. If you want to do this from another position, well, you have to make another measurement. And you can easily see where this will end up, right? If you're in a 3D space, you have to make countless measurements in this 3D environment. And not just that. If your transmitter is a human speaker, there's speech directivity. If I talk in this direction, it sounds very different compared to this direction, even without a microphone. So what you basically would have to do is also measure every head rotation of the transmitter and essentially also every head rotation of the receiver. It's very clearly infeasible to get all these measurements. What signal processing instead is doing is getting some sparse measurements from traditional, in rooms like with like single microphones and single loudspeakers, so traditional room impulse responses. And then a second set of measurements that are HRTF measurements, where you usually arrange loudspeakers in an array, in a spherical array around a listener in the middle, and then you get like angles like elevation and azimuth from where the sound is coming. And you get very sparse locations. And then if you want to resynthesize any spatial sound outside of these measured locations, then what you basically have to do is interpolation. And if you want to get closer or farther away, you manually have to like change the volume based on some assumptions. This works because the whole assumption is that both functions are linear. But that comes with other problems as well, right? So summarizing in traditional processing, we have a sampling problem. We can't sample the space as densely as we would need to if we really want to have accurate filters, accurate impulse responses for every scenario. We usually ignore important components such as speech directivity and do not model them at all. And that is something that is particularly important when you are having person-to-person communication where you get close to the other person. And then there's this linearity constraints. Everything is modeled with just a linear function. And this is particularly difficult if we want to combine this with vision. Of course, this is an audio-visual workshop, so the question is, how can we get visual components in this? We can easily do something with my body. I can hold my hand in front of my mouth. I will sound different. You can try it out if you take your hands like this or like this, and the way you perceive sound is very different. So whatever your body is doing has an influence on what you hear. And the same holds for the environment. The environment determines reverberation and has an influence on what you're doing. Well, if we could model everything instead of with a set of measured functions, with one single function that just gets the mono audio, the source audio as input, and the position of transmitter and receiver as input, well, then we could stick this into, some highly nonlinear neural network that produces results. Problem is machine learning methods are very data hungry. So the first question is, how can we actually get data? For the visual side, the common system, what you see here is actually our 3D capture dome in Pittsburgh, is to mount hundreds of cameras and hundreds of lights around you. You sit in there, you speak a bit, you make funny faces, and then from that we can build your avatar. For audio, we're building essentially the same thing. We have a big room, a big stage, where hundreds of artificial ear pairs are hanging from the ceiling. And then we can bring a person in this room. You see my colleague Steven here wearing a headset. He's talking. There is a microphone on the headset, so we get his speech signal. And all these ears that are hanging from the ceiling are gathering all the audio information from different spatial positions. So if we collect this kind of data, we send a bunch of people in there, let them speak each for half an hour, and we end up with something like this. Every point that you see here is 1 second of audio recorded at that specific positions, just from people walking around in this capture stage. And what you end up with is this donut-shaped or disc-shaped area where we have very dense coverage of spatial audio. It's about 4 meters in diameter, which is usually, the social space that we have if you want to talk to people in a VR setting or like, in any kind of meeting. So that is great. We can collect large amounts of spatialized audio data. The question is now how to model this. We could now throw everything into a neural network and hope it does well, but there are some physical constraints with audio that we explicitly want to use. One is that a transmitter and a receiver have a known distance to each other. Basically, we know in virtual reality, we have to render your avatar, so we know where you are, we know where your ears are. So we can effectively compute how far your ears are from the sound source, and then just map a signal based on the speed of sound. So it will, if your left ear is closer to the speaker position than your right ear, the signal will arrive at your left ear a little bit earlier than at your right ear. And well, let's look at an example here. The white curve that you see on the right is the mono speech signal. We can just take the signal, take the speed of sound, and based on the distance, warp it so that it is shifted where we expect it to arrive at the right ear and the left ear of the receiver. The blue and orange curve, the bright ones, are just the shifted signals of the input. What you see in shaded blue and shaded orange in the background is the ground truth binaural recording. We were basically, we have microphones in these artificial ears, and that is the ground truth that you see there in the background. What you can see is the peaks and valleys are like somewhat matched, but not perfectly. What is going on here? Well, of course, the direct path doesn't always exist. Your head might be in the way of the direct path, or the head of the receiver might be in the way of the direct path. Every red section here. So we learn a neural warp field that compensates for these effects. And if we compare this, I'm just going to switch forth and back. So we can take, the speed of sound-based warping that we had in the previous slide, and we can take this warp field, and we can now correct a little bit. I will just switch forth and back. And what you will see is that the peaks and valleys are aligned a little bit better already. But what we haven't done yet is adjust the amplitudes. Your ear basically transforms the signal as it bounces around. Your head transforms the signal. So we need to make some amplitude adjustment to really get things like the speaker directivity and your HRTF, your specific hearing patterns, right. We do this by taking what we had previously and feeding that into a wavenet together with the positions. And what you can see now is that we can match the ground truth really well. Let me again switch forth and back. This is what we had before. Now with amplitude attenuation, we get something that is very close to the actual ground truth signal. This is all great, right? So we have a neural network, a machine learning system that can render spatialized audio. If I now make a claim that this is better than traditional DSP, which has been, state of the art for 30 years, I better back that with evidence. So we actually did some kind of objective studies, objectively measured error on the waveform in the spectrogram, measured angular phase error, and found that this neural rendering indeed performs significantly better than traditional rendering. And also when we do user studies and ask people to listen to examples and rate them, where we give them the position of the sound and then rate them, how accurate is this the right location, users prefer the neural rendering of audio over the traditional rendering. And if we compare the waveforms, you see in orange here the prediction of our neural renderer and in blue the ground truth. And now if I go to the signal processing based method in red, and again in blue the ground truth, you see a clear difference, right? So the neural based rendering is a lot more accurate than the signal processing rendering. So that is great, meaning we have built a system that can render three-dimensional audio. And of course, we want to share this with the academic community, so we open source the data set and we open source the data that others can build on that and can use that. Now, I said we are all about audio-visual modeling, all about virtual reality and bringing audio and vision together. And what is the best use case or like the most engaging thing to show how audio together with avatars can work and can enhance the experience? Well, it's probably music. So we hired two singers from Los Angeles, flew them into Pittsburgh and recorded a song with them. And we render the avatars with our 3D rendering approaches, and we render the audio with our just developed 3D audio rendering method. And this does not come even close to the experience in VR, as you can imagine. So if you ever get the chance to visit our lab in Pittsburgh, make sure you see this demo. It's a really great experience. You see me in the top right corner. I'm wearing Quest 2, so the whole thing works on device. And I can walk around, and I can be far away and listen to it as you are used to in a concert, but you can also go in the middle of the singers and stand in between them and get this experience how it would be in between them. It's no comparison to how it is in VR. I'm still going to play it here in 2D for you, and you can hear that if I get closer to someone, I will hear them louder.
Again, no more while we seek mirth and beauty and music light and gay. There are threats getting at though their voices are silent, their pleading looks will say, our heart does again. Oh, no more.
And I should probably mention that Our avatars do usually not flicker, but it's probably the beamer or the presentation. But yeah, if you ever get the chance to come to Pittsburgh, make sure you see these demos. It's really amazing to be in VR and have this audiovisual 3D experience. Great, so we have designed this audio rendering method now with machine learning. But again, I was saying this is an audio-visual workshop, so we are interested in bringing the modalities together and not just in doing 3D audio rendering. So what have we actually achieved? We have a function here that gets from a headset or something the input from the headset user, and that gets the position between the transmitter and receiver and can render left and right ear audio from the receiver's perspective. What we actually want to be able is to say, additionally to the input audio and the position, let's condition that on something like bodies, on something like environment. And this is something that is ongoing research, where we want to build on the system that we just developed, the baseline essentially, that is audio rendering only. But the nice thing is now, because it is a neural network, we have a pretty good idea how to do multimodal fusion in neural networks, right? We can take body pose and compute some abstract encoding of body poses. We can take spaces and compute neural features for three-dimensional spaces and feed them into a network and let the network figure out, based on these features and based on the audio that has been trained on, what it needs to do with the sound to augment it further. And I want to focus a little bit on the body. That's something that we are currently ramping up. We were actually building a capture stage to capture body sounds. So this is an anechoic chamber. And if we go in there, you see the spherical arrangement with hundreds of microphones around you pointing all towards the center. And you may also see that there are some Kinects mounted to the structure. So what you can actually do is you can enter this capture stage. You can stand there with your body. And you can do whatever you want. You can speak, you can snap, you can clap your hands, and you can scratch yourself, you can walk, whatever makes a sound, right? And with all these microphones, we can capture the sound and accurately reproduce the sound field. Sound field is nothing else than a pressure field, right? Sound is just a change in air pressure, and the microphones are measuring exactly that. So with all these microphones, we can measure that super densely and reconstruct that. And with the Kinects, we can reconstruct your body. I want to give an example here. This is my colleague Israel. He's standing in this capture stage, and in this green cube, you see the sound field reconstruction. I'm just going to play this.
What is the? How do you define?
So you see the speech coming out of his mouth and producing waveforms, but even more than that, he can touch his thighs, and we can essentially measure the change in sound pressure in the space as he touches his legs, and we get this very accurate reconstruction of that. And this is maybe my favorite example. He will be snapping his fingers, and what you can see is how the sound waves emerge around his hand. Of course, in super slow motion, because sound in reality would move super fast. So this is super slow motion, but you hear him snap, and then you see how the sound propagates through the space. And this is pretty exciting, right? Because with this kind of data, with this kind of capture stage that allows us to bring bodies and sound into the same room and measure them simultaneously, we have an option to really learn these correlations between what your body is doing, what you are doing as your avatar in virtual reality, and what the impact on audio is. And we can also do the opposite. For example, I could be, wearing just a headset with a single microphone. If there's just a snap, it's impossible to tell where it's coming from. Is it from the left? Is it from the right? Where exactly is it? But if we condition this system on the body pose, we know it's coming here from the hand and it's not coming out of my mouth. So all of a sudden we have a way to model a body in 3D. And as you produce sounds with your body, the sound will emerge from the right position, from your hand, from your foot, wherever it's happening. It's really exciting to, pioneer this kind of work and build these systems. But the exciting part is it also works in the other direction. I was earlier talking about augmented reality glasses, something not bigger than my glasses, for example. And even with regular virtual reality headsets, if you know the Quest 2, right, it's not very big. So if you mount cameras, you can maybe see your face, but it's impossible to see your complete body. So how can you animate your body in virtual reality in a way that it looks plausible and realistic if you have only very limited camera information and mostly occlusions? And multimodality is certainly the correct path. And audio is one of the most obvious complementary modalities because while in vision there is this concept of occlusion, it doesn't really exist in audio, right? Just because my nice belly is in the way to see my feet doesn't mean that I can't hear my feet if I stomp on the floor. So audio is really some kind of complementary information here. And with this kind of data, we are able to actually learn these correlations. What does a change in audio mean for the change of our body pose? So it's really something where we can model both directions, from bodies to spatial audio, and from spatial audio to bodies. This is ongoing research, and it's really exciting, but we do not yet have results that we can show here. So maybe on an upcoming conference, on an upcoming presentation, we will talk about this. Yeah, and with this, I'm almost at the end. So again, the focus in the audio team in our lab is primarily to bring those modalities together that are necessary in virtual reality to bridge this gap that we have to a photo and photorealistic virtual experience, to like a communication that is in 3D, in a shared space, and that brings us a lot closer when we want to have a meaningful, real conversation with people than video calling can ever do. And I was presenting a method for 3D audio rendering here that we did. I think it was on iClear 2021. So it's some time ago. Of course, we looked further into that and advanced the method. And one really interesting finding there is that, well, you are certainly aware of the nerve explosion in the graphics community, and there are countless methods for rendering visual scenes. And it's really interesting that we can take very similar methods, carry them over to audio. Of course, you have to adjust them a little bit to the specific properties of audio, but that nerve style methods work surprisingly well for audio rendering as well. So it's really exciting to see how these modalities over time slowly converge together and how the methods that work well on graphics tend to work well on audio and vice versa. So it's a really nice development, and I'm really curious to see where this will lead in the future. And since this is my last slide, I will finish my talk here. Thank you.
Questions?
Hey, very cool talk. So I saw that like when you were recording the data, you were using a very controlled environment. So how do you think this will generalize to like uncontrolled and like really unseen environments?
Yes. So there are two answers to this. The first answer is we are doing research, so this is far from being anywhere close to a product. And I think, in order to really understand the space, a controlled environment is the right thing, where you know what data you have and where you can see what is the maximum you can reach. And then you can go down and lower the bar and see what happens in the wild. The second answer is we usually talk about encoders and decoders. Decoders is what generates the output in VR, and that is something that we can always train on clean data. And encoder is then the magical piece that has to take in the wild data, noisy in the wild data, and map it onto a latent embedding that represents clean data. And that in the end ends up being a speech enhancement problem, a resounding problem for visual spaces, and things like that, right? But you can really fairly disentangle these two components, and this is the way we are going. And with what I was presenting here, this is primarily the research on the decoder side. How do we generate what we want to have in VR? And then the question that you are asking is basically what we need to do in the next 1 to 2 years.
Hi, great talk. Might be a complementary question to the previous one. How about a virtual environment for recording the audio? Like I think one of the previous lectures here, they showed they simulated audio via something like Unity or something like that.
Right. These audio simulations, of course, need an algorithm that simulate realistic 3D spatial audio. And these algorithms are based on traditional signal processing. So if our goal is to be better than that, how can we ever be better if our ground truth is exactly traditional signal processing? So I think real data is really the key here. And figuring out how to get the right real data is always a challenge. But it's the only way to really solve the problem and to really get to a level of realism that not just consciously you can say this is right, but even subconsciously your brain will tell you, oh yeah, this is reality.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So this one is not super technical about the presentation, but what's your feeling about the uncanny valley or the sensation that
Excuse me, there was some noise here. Can you ask again, please.
Sorry, what do you think about the uncanny valley in this
Yeah.
context of?
So the uncanny valley is pretty well researched on the visual side, and the acoustic uncanny valley is very poorly researched, at least in a machine learning community, in the sense of how can we actually test if we are in this valley. And the problem with that is that as humans, we are audiovisual beings, so we perceive all modalities at the same time. So if there is uncanniness in vision, you will always automatically think audio is uncanny. And if there is uncanniness in audio, you will always automatically think that vision is uncanny. So it's really hard to overcome this. And our strategy to do this is not to optimize for perceptual metrics primarily, but really to optimize for real metrics like L2, something where we can really have a signal, measure it in reality, and if we would put the same sensor in virtual reality, measure the same signal there, it should be exactly the same. If we reach that, then by definition, it's not uncanny anymore because it's exactly what it is in reality. But yeah, it's a very good question, and it's very hard to disambiguate that. I think learning on a metric base, with a metric-based strategy is really the only way how we can get there, because psychologically for us, it's very hard to distinguish where uncanniness is rooted in.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Alex.